Well, hello from Virginia. My name is Barbara Dill, and here's my shop. And this video is about split turnings. I'm making a series of videos because I think it's important. It's an important area of wood turning that has a lot of options that a lot of us haven't explored yet. So I hope this will stimulate people to be interested and do some exploration on their own. A split turning is what happens when you put two or more pieces of wood together and attach them together safely, and then put them between centers on the lathe. And you can turn either two or four sides on these. And the reason I got interested in split turnings is that I was exploring multi-axis turnings and realized that the lathe does get way off balance sometimes. And this would be a way to put larger pieces on the lathe and have the lathe be balanced and also make duplicates, multiples of the same idea. It also became a way that I could explore what would happen on parallel axes arc type, which is in quadrant 1. I experimented a lot in quadrant 1 to see what would happen when I cut beads or coves or V-cuts on wood. And I realized that my experiments only were on two axes. So split turnings help me explore what happens when you turn all four axes at 90 degrees. Split turnings, the first introduction I had to split turnings was in Tennessee in the early 90s when I'd gone to Aramont in 90, 91, and 92 to study wood turning. That was at the beginnings of my wood turning career. And because Tennessee is my home state, I would go back and go to Aramont or go to some of the symposiums in Middle Tennessee. And I saw people doing split turnings with smaller pieces of wood. They would glue pieces of wood together, or they would make a cradle on each end to put the squares in and then put it between centers and turn it. I was intrigued with that, and what people were doing then is then gluing pieces back up and making inside out turnings, which became beautiful little ornaments. But I didn't follow through with that idea for a few reasons. One is that in order to make inside out turnings, the glue joint really nice, you should use your table saw to make really clean cuts so the glue joints are good. And I don't like to use my table saw. I'd rather use my bandsaw. And the second thing was, back then, I didn't know how to make the cradles to put on the ends. But since then, a lot of people have done split turnings. And the ways that we connect the wood together has evolved over the years. So I'll show you the way that works for me the best. One thing you need to know is that I have been an experimental turner. I have enjoyed exploring multi-axis turnings. And before I figured out a way to understand it, I just randomly changed the axis, and then I didn't know what to do, and I got quite frustrated with that, and that was in the 90s. And in 2006, I figured out the way to understand it. And those videos have already been published. They're on my YouTube channel. They're called Chapters 1 and Chapters 2. Chapter 1 is the systematic explanation of multi-axis turning. Chapter 2 is how all the variables apply to those ideas. Now, split turnings are in that first quadrant. They're all parallel axes, and they're all arc type. They're all in quadrant 1, other than if you're Mark Spheri. And I saw at a demo years ago at a symposium, Mark put two pieces of wood together, and instead of putting the centers of the axis in the middle, he put it on one side and then the opposite side on the other end. And he created these turnings that are twisted axes, and they're done by split turnings. Well, I was intrigued by that, and I came home and did it myself, and I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if you can do it on 4 pieces of wood. And I started this project, and I think I got intimidated because it gave me the biggest brain cramp I've ever had, so I stopped it. But one day I might go and explore that idea, or you can too. One history of split turnings is that architectural and furniture makers have used split turnings by gluing up 2 pieces of wood, putting them between centers turning an element and then being able to create a frame or an element on a piece of furniture or a building. So that was really the history, but I didn't know that for a long time because all I had seen is wood turners putting 2 or 4 pieces of wood together. So in this video, I will be going over a brief history of split turnings, both architectural turnings and mainly wood turners, and some of the stars that have made some amazing things. And I'll review the way I got into split turnings and some of my earlier works and what my thinking process was. And then I'll review some important considerations like how to prep the wood, how to attach the wood together safely, how to think about the depth of cut and the profile, and talk about those ideas. And then we'll be back in my shop and I'll do a live demo of putting some wood together and turning it. Next, I'm going to show a very short preview of the conceptual model used to understand multi-axis spindles, because split turning certainly does fall into this model. There's a few basic ideas that are quite simple. One is that there are only 2 ways that the new axis can be moved relative to the center axis. It's either going to be parallel to that center axis, or it's not going to be parallel. It will cross either that axis or any line parallel to that axis. Here are some drawings of the way the axes can be placed. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see the 2 basic types, either parallel to the center axis or not parallel, which is called twisted. There can be 1 axis on one end and many on the other. These new axes can be parallel to each other, but yet cross the center axis, but they're called twisted axes. They can be 120 or 90 degrees apart, or any degree of separation. They can be closer to the outside of the spindle or to the inside of the spindle, which makes a big difference in the outcome and the design. And if you see the image, the rectangular drawing in the middle, they can even be on the sides of a spindle. There are no limits to where the new axis can be placed. The other fundamental and striking discovery is that there can only be 2 types of outcomes once you change a axis. You either go all the way through the air wood and develop a cylinder on which you turn a profile. That's the one on the right. Or if you cut into the air wood, those profiles intersect, creating a very different looking design. So that's arc type and circular type. There are variables that apply to all 4 quadrants, and they can simply be broken down into the size and the shape of the wood, the millions of axes that opportunities that can be used, and the profile, which it can be broken down also into a bead, a cove, and a V-cut. Now, because there are only 2 types of axes relative to the center axis that can be used when you change the axis, and only 2 outcomes, circular and arc type, we can create a table that has these variables in quadrants. So there are families of spindles. In the top, quadrant 1 have parallel axes and arc type. Underneath it are arc type but yet twisted axes. On the right side of these tables is quadrant 3, which is parallel axes and circular type. And then there's quadrant 4 underneath that, which are twisted axes and circular type. I have a few videos on my YouTube channel. I've written a book. I've written articles about these ideas. But the essence of split turnings is, as long as you put the ends of the groups of wood that you collect together in the center of those pieces of wood, all split turnings can be found in quadrant 1, which makes them arc type and parallel axes. So that means that whatever you can find on one spindle using parallel axes and arc type, you can create small ideas, and then you can say, oh, I can do that with 2 or 4 pieces of wood. Having the internet is certainly wonderful when you want to do some research about some of the work that's been done in the past. This one is a split turning. It's an architectural turning. Here's some inside out turnings that were done by other people. I found them on Instagram, I think, to make tables or ornaments. This is a friend, Doug Campbell. He's the master of askew, and he makes beautiful inside out turnings. Vivian is an artist in my area, in the Richmond area, who's doing some incredibly creative work, and I look forward to seeing more of her work. I captured this video off of her Instagram page. I think it's fascinating. I've always thought Peter Exton was a genius when it comes to multi-axis turning. He does not use squares like most of us or rectangles. He cuts diamonds with his table saw, and he thinks about the negative space of these creations. I've gone to his website and I love the way he thinks. He's written quite a lot about it. He demoed in one of our symposiums in Connecticut years ago, and I've learned quite a lot from him. But he's a person that I think has mastered split turnings and inside out turnings. I've done a little research on our AAW site and only found a couple of articles that have been written about split turnings. The other artist that I'm totally in awe of is Art Leisman. I was fortunate enough to assist him at Arrowmont years ago. He does therming, which is putting pieces of wood in a jig that keeps the axis far away from the center axis of the lathe. And so I enjoyed this. I think it's a part of split turning, but the wood itself does not touch the axis of the lathe. So I think it's a little different in that respect. One of the people that was in the class was Brian Horace, who was interested in segmented turnings, therming, and split turnings. So these next images are going to be Brian's work, and I was really impressed with his artistry. He was on the board of the AAW for a while, and I've learned that he has passed away in the last year. I mentioned earlier that early in the 90s in Tennessee, I had discovered this type of split turning, but I didn't follow through with it just because I didn't know how to make the box that they put the ends in. However, I was always interested in multi-axis spindles and got frustrated during the 90s, but in 2006 figured out a systematic way to understand them. So I kept turning small pieces of wood and making stems for goblets and other things. And then in around 2009, I thought I wanted to use bigger pieces of wood. So here are a few examples of my first split turnings that I did. The turnings on the left, the cherry ones, were just turned on two opposite sides and then finished between centers. The candle holders in the middle were turned on all four sides, and they're holly, but one was dyed black. The ones on the right were also turned on two sides opposite each other and all made out of one piece of wood. And I had beginner's luck when I made those, and they were published in our journal. So here's an image of that, and it may have been in the same journal that my article was published in. At any rate, I tried to make more of the Cobra-like candle holders, and I had terrible luck trying to figure them out. It took me a month or two of obsessing to really understand how to turn them well. This image just shows how you can create things on smaller pieces of wood and get an idea, and then translate it to split turnings. And here are some images of some of the many trials I went through to figure out how to make these specific candle holders. I think I've mentioned that it's taken me quite a while to start being a little more creative and experimental. I realized that I had done alternating beads and coves and V-cuts on parallel axes and archetype forms. But I thought, wow, I bet I could do that on split turnings. So the walnut one in the middle are two rectangles that are split turned. And then the one next to it is a cherry, one of four that was turned by split turnings. The significant difference between the cherry one and the two that were turned together is that the orientation of the bottom on the when you turn four pieces of wood, it points towards the corner, which is a design element. And look at the two pieces of wood, the design elements face the flat part of the wood. The one on the right is out of holly, and it was turned between centers. So then I started playing with four pieces of wood and alternating beads. So on one axis, I would turn beads, and in this case, I was tapering them from the bottom, which would be on the left, to the top, which would be on the right. And then in the next slide, you'll see how I've changed the axes, and I've advanced each axis by a quarter because there are four axes, and that's what the tape on the tool rest is telling me of how to measure those beads. Here's the larger pieces of wood because I wanted to make more sculptural pieces, and they turned out quite nicely, and here they are in action. I took this video earlier today. I've been getting out all the studies that I've done to experiment with different ideas. I seem to keep a lot of them, but you'll see a lot of the various ideas that I've played with. I like to have them around so I can see what I've done and look at elements and see if I want to reproduce them at all. But it's been an exciting study of what happens when you put square pieces of wood together. In this next section, I'm going to talk about how to prep the wood, how to attach the wood together, how to determine the depth of cut, which is a very interesting idea and concept, and thinking about the profile. I've always enjoyed using green wood and local woods, so I have wanted to turn most of my work out of green woods. So here is an image of how I prep the wood with my chainsaw, and then I use the bandsaw with a fence in order to cut squares of wood as accurately as I can in case I want to make an inside-out turning or just to make the glue joints work better and help me attach the wood more safely. There are many ways to attach the wood safely together, and through the years I've seen screws used, I've seen hose clamps, which I've used before, cable ties, and many types of glues have been used, wood glued CA glue and hot glue. But I always learn something at my meetings, turning meetings that I go to, and Brian Noble did a demo years ago and used hot glue safely, so I have started using hot glue for this work. And here are a few images of some earlier work that I did, but notice I used hose clamps in this one. And in the next one I used ties, and then I did discover hot glue. So I realized, though, if you use more than a dab of hot glue, it will tear the grain out. So you have to separate them very carefully. But in the following image is an image of using hot glue, a plexiglass center on the very ends so that the points of the headstock and the tailstock don't separate these four pieces of wood, and strapping tape to tape it all together after you tack it together with hot glue. And notice on that image that I was able to use badly cut bandsaw pieces that were held together with the plexiglass and the dabs of hot glue and the strapping tape. So it was a safe turning. The issue about how to determine the depth of cut is probably the most stunning discovery that I made, because what I would do is when I put 4 pieces of wood together, I would turn the first axis into a cylinder. So here's a drawing of what 4 pieces of wood put together looks like on the ends. In the upper left quadrant, you see one piece of wood that in itself has a purple circle in it that represents the cylinder within that square piece of wood. And if I turn off more than the tangent, that green tangent in the upper left-hand corner, then what I'm doing is turning off that black circle on all of these pieces of wood. And the area marked X in the middle is all I have left to make an interesting turning out of. It took me such a long time to figure that out. Just to clarify, that area that is marked X, that is the area I would have left if I turned each side of 4 sides to a cylinder. And this makes a lot of sense when I think about what Max Brosi taught us when he was here about how to make a sphere. And the mechanics or the math of doing that is that you find this tangent, which is the bottom line on the lower right-hand corner or the top left-hand corner. Now, there's a mathematical formula to figure that out. If you know how square that is, in this case it was 8.5 millimeters, you multiply that by 0.293 and you get 0.74 inches. You draw that tangent there, and then you'll know the depth of cut for that piece of wood to make a sphere. And that number 0.74 is the measurement from the corner of that square to the tangent line. So you can measure that on each side of the square and be able to cut that 45-degree angle. And if you see the sphere on the right, one of those cuts was that 45-degree angle, and you've just about already made a sphere. All you have to do is nibble off the rest of the wood. But when making a split turning, I don't need to know the math. All I need to do is mark a tangent on the wood and mark it all the way down so I'll have my depth of cut. I found that it's hard when you're turning 4 pieces of wood because you're looking at the diagonal and it is hard to judge the depth of cut. So now let's go out to my shop and see how all this fits together. First, I use green wood in my chainsaw and my bandsaw. If you want perfect cuts, you can use a table saw, but I guess everybody will figure out how to prep the wood. And Alex Snodgrass came over. There's a video of him tweaking my 1990 Delta bandsaw. And now when I put a fresh blade on, which I do when I want to make these cuts, I can make fairly accurate cuts using the fence and a way to measure the tilt of the blade so that I have really reliable cuts. And then there's a stack of wood there that I've created for my split turnings. So now I've prepped the wood on my bandsaw, and I've been able to create 4 pieces of wood that are very similar. And with my techniques of using hot glue and a few scraps of wood, I'll be able to glue them up perfectly. But my decision now is, what am I going to make? Now, if I had made these shorter, then I would think about doing something like this inside out turning. It's shorter and squattier. This was just turned on opposite sides, not 4 sides, but 2. Here's one, a short and squatty one. I didn't finish it. It could have been an inside out turning similar to this. But I can have longer pieces of wood, and I can alternate beads and coves and V-cuts, which is all quadrant 1 is, using archetype and cutting into the air wood, you just match up coves and beads and V-cups, straight lines, long coves, short coves, asymmetrical coves, symmetrical coves. So the sky is the limit on anything you can turn in that quadrant. You can do as a split turning. And here's a good example of how to play with these ideas. These were turned as a set of 4 like this. And then when I finished them, I alternated, I turned one upside down so that they're not identical pairs, they complement each other. So there are many ways you can play with the proportions of the elements that you turn so that you can then mix and match and do all sorts of fun things with them. So I've let my hot glue gun warm up, and now I'm going to tack these 4 pieces of wood together, just using a dab of glue. So I'll put a little dab on each top square, there and there, and then I'll set that there. And I haven't numbered them yet, so it doesn't matter what order I glue them together or tack them together right now. And let's put a dab here and a dab there, and tack these together, making them as square as I can. And now all I have to do is tack the 4 together. So I'll put a little dab here, 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 and here. This hot glue gun goes off after 15 minutes, which is good because every now and then I've forgotten. Now I'm getting these as square as I can. Granted, they were cut on the bandsaw, so they're not going to be perfect like they would be on a table saw and a chop saw, but this is going to work. And now, before I do anything else, I want to get my magic marker out and number these, and also draw a circle on the end. Now I can take a little circle and just draw a circle on one end of one of these pieces of wood. Doesn't have to be totally accurate, but this will give me an idea of how much wood I'm going to cut off when I start turning these 4 blocks. The other thing I need to do now is number, I always put arrows here, but I could number that number 1. And then I'll number 2, 3, and 4 in sequence on all of these pieces of wood. 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, and 4. And now I'm ready to hot glue the plexiglass on each end and put it on the lathe. So I can reuse these plexiglass pieces, and one broke here, so I'm going to create a new one. So first I need to drill a hole so that the points of the headstock and the tailstock can go into the plexiglass. Next thing I need to do is scrape off the old glue so that this will make a nice fit on the wood. And once I get most of the glue off, I really want to scrape off everything else so that these are nice and flat. And now they're ready to be glued onto the ends. I can use the hot glue as a gap filler as well because these aren't perfectly the same length. Because it's plexiglass, I can now see where the hole is and center the hole right at the center of these 4 pieces of wood. So I'll do this on both sides. And then I'm ready to put it on the lathe and wrap it with strapping tape. So I'm ready to put this on the lathe, and the drives that I use on the headstock, before I use plexiglass, I would use 1.25 drive, 4-prong drive, and put the point in the center and have each of the prongs on each piece of the wood. But now that I've figured out how to use plexiglass, I thought about using this little center, the one I use for most of my multi-axis work, but I decided that the better one to use would be this one right here. And so I will put that in the headstock. I will center that. I know where the hole is. And then put the tailstock in the center of the plexiglass, and we'll be good to go, meaning that we will be good to then strap this with strapping tape. So before I compress it very much, I will use my strapping tape and I'll stretch the tape as I put it on. So I'll start it and then really stretch it so that it will be really tight on the wood, because those hot glue is just a dab to tack it together. So now all I have to do is cut that off and do the other end. I usually put too much on, so I'm only wrapping it 2 or 3 times. This is very strong tape. And especially on the tape, I will bend the corner back or else it will take me a few hours to find it again, and that's frustrating. So now we're ready to turn. Now what I want you to see is the circle that I drew on the end. That is my depth of cut. Now I could figure this distance out mathematically, or I can draw a tangent, which would be a perpendicular line to the diagonal, and then measure the distance from the corner to the ends. And that I will draw a line all the way across my turning and know that the depth of cut that's the only depth of cut I need to turn as I'm preparing this. Now, as I've taught through the years, I've maintained that there are no right or wrong tools to use. It's just what we learned initially with when we were learning, and then we have made these tools our own. My favorite tool that I use instead of a skew is a 1/2-inch spindle gouge sharpened to a fingernail grind. And I feel like I can make beads and coves and V-cuts with this reliably. The skew and I didn't like each other. But the other tool that I use, instead of a spindle roughing gouge, I use a 1/2-inch bowl gouge sharpened at about a 45-degree angle to mimic a roughing gouge. I like this tool because then I can make longer cuts when I'm doing multi-axis work. And I've also sharpened a 1/2-inch bowl gouge with the same angles on the Wolverine as I do a spindle gouge, just because it's a sturdier tool to reach further off the tool rest and to be able to make some cuts. Well, these are 3 of my favorite tools. They're not what you should use, but they work for me. Now I've tightened the tailstock, I've adjusted the tool rest, and I've turned the speed down on the lathe, and now I have to plug it in. Ha! I unplugged the lathe because we have a lot of thunderstorms around here. And we also lose our power out here in rural Virginia. So I'd rather the lathe be unplugged if I'm not going to use it, especially if a storm is coming. So now, like I said, everything's tight. I turned the lathe to nothing, 0. And now I will find a speed that feels comfortable to me. I don't like to turn these really fast because it's a heavier block of wood and they are glued together, but I'd rather not let speed get out of control when I'm turning split turnings. So right now, I'm just going to cut down to that line, which will give me enough wood cut off so that I won't be taking off too much. So I've made a little groove on this end, and now I'll be working downhill down the grain to match that. And let's see where I am. Yeah, I've touched that line, so now all I have to do is match it, and then I'll decide what profile to turn. So I'm looking around at some of the multi-axis work that I've done, and I think what I'm going to do on this, on my first axis, is just turn a nice asymmetrical cove. I like to make really light cuts and play like every cut is a finishing cut so that I get practice in making smooth cuts, because I don't like sanding, especially multi-axis work. Going to refine that cove, and then I might change the axis. Okay, I don't know if I recorded that last session or not, but I just had to sharpen my tool, turn the light on so I could see better. Yeah, a sharp tool works so much better. All right, well, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to take it apart and change the axis. First, what I like to do is take off the tape while it's still on the lathe. And then I like to try to save this tape. So I have dusted off my tailstock, and I will just put it there and do the same on this end. And now once that's off, I can take this off the lathe and take it apart, basically. Okay, so I'll pop this off as gently as I can. I don't want to break it. Loosen up that glue. There it comes. Come on. And I'll do that on the other end. I was pretty liberal with the glue because it is a gap filler on the ends. And now I will gently separate these pieces of wood. Like I said, the hot glue will tear out the grain of the wood if you're not careful. So okay, they're coming apart, just these two right here. Oops. There we go. Next thing I'm going to do is rotate them. The arrows were in the middle. Now I'm going to rotate them so that number 2 is in the middle. It could be number 4. I like to do 90-degree turns just because I get to see how the axis that I'm turning relates to the one I just turned. So now I've rotated them so that the 2s are in the middle, and I will be gluing them up and putting the plexiglass back on, putting it between center, strapping them up, and then you'll see axis 2. Okay, now I've got it on the second axis, and I've cut the extra wood off. I haven't cut too much wood out of it. And I think on this axis, I'll do another cove, and I'll also do it asymmetrical with the heaviest part, the deepest part on this end. Yeah, this sharp tool makes it so much easier. And I think I said before that turning split turnings does encourage experimentation on 4 axes that are separated by 90 degrees, as opposed to when I did it between centers in quadrant 1, I usually didn't do all 4. But this is a lot more fun now to experiment and just see what happens. And here's what that second axis looks like. There's a nice sharp line that the 2 first axes are intersecting, so that's really nice. I'll continue with this, and then I'll get back to you with the third axis. Okay, I'm ready to turn the third side, but first I need to mark my depth of cut, and I've already sort of measured it on this little ruler here, so I'll mark a line so I'll know how much wood to cut off of this axis before I start doing my profile. So there's that line, and with the light on I can see that as I turn. Put my tool rest back where it goes, swirl it around, make sure this is tight enough. I always turn the speed down a little bit just to start it off, and then I'll get it up to speed where it feels comfortable. It seems to always feel comfortable around 470, 450, something like that. Checking my mic. Put my face shield on and take off about a ½ inch on this axis. I did spend some time taking the old hot glue off so that my glue joints would be a little better. Okay. Now I'm going to rearrange the camera and do the next profile. Since I've done 2 coves, I think I want to do a bead on this one. Well, since I turned asymmetrical coves, I think I'll turn asymmetrical beads, meaning the bead will be higher here and then lower down here. In order to turn a bead, I first need to do some bead cuts. Now I've cut into that by about 1 inch, and let me just stop the lathe and see how I'm doing. I can go a lot deeper. So this will take a minute just to slowly create this bead. And this is a ½ inch spindle gouge. I do have a bowl gouge that's sharpened like a spindle gouge that is also a little heavier, makes these cuts just a little easier to make. I can't really make the bead cut as thin because this is a fatter tube, but at least I can do some of the heavy work with this tool. I can use my bowl gouge sharpened like a roughing gouge now to make some of these heavier cups to roll the bead over. Okay. Maybe I can turn with the camera there so you can see. Let's see how everything's looking. Okay, this intersection with this axis is doing well. I think I want to make that more of a V cut up here and then make that a little deeper, which I can do. So I'll keep working on this. I just wanted to point out that what we're looking at is the diagonal. So it's really hard to really see the depth of cut on each individual spindle. But I'm going to take a little more out here and go a lot deeper up here. Okay, and here's what the third axis looks like, which is a bead. It's on top of two coves. I'll take it apart and we'll examine it and then decide the fourth axis. Okay, it's glued up for the fourth axis. I did make a mistake and I caught it right away, so it was easy to fix. I wanted to put all the fours together and I glued up two at a time, but then I reversed one, so it wasn't right. But it's easy to take apart when the glue is still fresh. So now this is, we have a cove on two axes and a bead on the other. First I'll cut down to my depth line, and then I'll decide what I want to do with it as I watch it evolve. Now, I think what I'm going to do is make some V-cuts and just sort of play around with some ideas. Take a look. I do want to stop and start a lot just to make sure that I'm not cutting an area too thin. But I'll finish this cut and then I'll do that. Okay, so far I'm just going to keep playing with it now, and I'll get the camera back on once I finish it. I'm going to go ahead and record some of this because What I think is so magical about turning multi-axis things is the way it dances in the light. So I just love watching that as I develop these ideas. Let me see what it looks like. All right, I think I know what I'm going to do up here. Well, I think I like this, and I think it's ready to be taken apart and to look at it individually as individual spindles. It's been a fun project, though. Well, here they are all separated, and these two are upright. The same, these are upside down. So let's just see how they play with each other. Let's see these two, how they interact. So it'll be a lot of fun just to start examining these and deciding what life has in store for them. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into the whole concepts of split turnings. I'm sure there are a lot of things I've left out, a lot of work that's been done that I'm not aware of, but this is my perspective on this area of turning. A couple of things I want to mention, and that is this whole thing about multi-axis turning and split turnings. They're concepts. Nobody owns them. I've been mesmerized by it since 2006 and focused on teaching it and understanding more about it. It's been fascinating to me. But if anybody else wants to teach it, feel free to use the materials I've developed. Feel free to talk to me. I encourage that because I think this is an area of wood turning that's fascinating and lots more people could be having fun with it. So take it and use it and teach it and enjoy it. And I also like to talk a little bit about creativity. We're not born with a creative bone in our bodies, contrary to popular belief. Creativity is more muscular. It's a practice. It's not about having perfect ideas or brilliant ideas, but it is about showing up every day and making. So I hope you enjoy your practice of wood turning and exploration.